Hi, everybody. My name is Amina Fazlullah, and I'm the Director of Equity Policy for Common Sense. And today I wanted to walk through some of the findings of our series of 3 reports plus a 4th additional report that we did over the course of the pandemic thus far that defined, measured, seeking to understand the K-12 digital divide. And it was used in order to build rapid response and long-term public policy solutions. Before COVID-19, efforts to close the digital divide were largely scattered across a lot of diverse institutions. Schools relied on these other institutions, libraries, after-school programs, other digital divide organizations at the ground level. And students and in vulnerable families were left to just seek out solutions wherever they could. That could mean just sitting in the parking lot of your library, going to a Starbucks or a McDonald's, or as people have seen famously during the pandemic, kids sitting outside of a Taco Bell. Wherever there was broadband available, kids would just gravitate towards it because they didn't have it at home. And for whatever reason, that seemed like an acceptable solution prior to COVID, because the pandemic drove so many students home simultaneously. Schools had to face the fact that their students didn't have internet access at home, and now it was impacting their sometimes state constitutionally ordered responsibility to deliver equitable access to education. So schools were at a crossroad and had to pick up the slack in terms of supporting and addressing the K-12 digital divide for their students. And, no surprise to anybody watching this, but, this K-12 digital divide and school closure, these two issues together were, very concerning for educators because they felt like it would drive and accelerate learning loss for students. And to some extent, there really isn't a clear picture of what that learning loss may look like. But I think that most people agree that, the school closures due to the pandemic and disruptions to in-person learning, coupled with not enough robust access to distance learning resources, has certainly driven different trajectories in learning loss. And what wasn't out there at the start of the pandemic was specifically what was needed by schools and educators to support kids doing learning from home. And what we found is relatively obvious, but it is worth saying it had not actually been sort of explicitly listed out. And so our research set out to work with educators, technology companies, ed tech companies, state departments of ed to highlight what was actually needed. High-speed broadband internet service to the home and internet-enabled devices that could be used for curriculum-specific material. So in some circumstances, a tablet might work fine. In some circumstances, a laptop or a desktop, something more robust, will be required. And sometimes you can go in between with something like a Chromebook and something that's a little bit more sort of lightweight. But certainly what we found and what we wanted to highlight for policymakers was that phones weren't enough. And this is an important point because if you look at broadband penetration rates that include mobile phone and mobile phone usage through data, the penetration rates among low-income and vulnerable families look pretty high, but that's because they're depending on mobile phones. And mobile phone data is an incredibly expensive pathway to getting onto the internet. So it's also one that is very constrained. So we wanted to highlight the value of having, dedicated broadband resources to the home and an actual device that was not a mobile phone. Next, we wanted to set out some tech specs. Again, hadn't been done before, surprisingly, and was really important to actually demonstrating to policymakers what they had to incorporate into any kind of policy solution so that they didn't fall too far below what the technical specifications would be to effectively address the problem. Again, not rocket science here, but it just hadn't been done. And in part, that's because it's a moving target. And so it's valuable to know that even our research, what had been done back in 2020 and has been sort of refreshed since then, sets out speeds that will evolve. And so what we found was robust distance learning requires speeds and data that's sufficient for multiple hours of two-way video that can serve multiple users with an undisrupted experience inside the household. And for that, we found 200 megabytes down and 10 megabytes up. And we thought that was an important number to have out there because we wanted to make sure whatever public policy solution was deployed could actually meet the needs of the use of broadband. That, you know, we weren't just trying to get broadband out the door for the sake of having a connection, but a connection that actually met the needs of the individual household. And again, we also noted the importance of devices that were robust, that were new, that, you know, weren't breaking down on children, and that had enough memory to allow for a seamless experience, especially with real-time learning tools. Again, you know, it's probably not surprising, but the reason for this is that any barrier to a student who's distance learning, who's already experiencing the barrier of distance, is potentially hugely impactful in terms of their learning experience, that it could really shut down learning for the day if you have even one disruption in the quality of service of that distance learning experience, whether that's because of the device or because of the connectivity. We also put out numbers that demonstrated, and I want to be very clear about this, the persistent K-12 digital divide. What we believe at Common Sense is that there are going to be about 15 to 16 million kids who will persistently be in the K-12 digital divide. They will lack adequate access to internet or devices to sustain effective learning at home. And what we believe is that 1 year of devices or a few months of broadband service will not stop their existence in the digital divide. It supports them while their family is one that will be in the digital divide. And that's in part because of income and poverty and other sort of larger issues that are pressing on these families. So it's important for policymakers, educators, anyone seeking to support folks who are in the digital divide to understand that this is a long-term issue and that these numbers are persistent. And so they help guide the types of solutions that you are building. They aren't actually, giving you an indication of the current status of the digital divide, because that's only really useful to those folks who are sort of procuring and are on the ground deploying solutions. But for folks who are actually trying to come up with a long-term policy solution, it's important for them to understand that this is likely a relatively static number, that there will be obviously some change over time depending on employment status, et cetera. But for the most part, we believe this 15 to 16 million number of students will likely be static for their entire K-12 career. The other thing that we noted was that it was important for policymakers politically, but it was also important just for our own understanding of the digital divide, that it exists pretty much in every state in the country. Um, Even in the most well-connected states, 1 in 4 students do not have an adequate internet connection or device. That's a huge problem. That means where we're doing best, we're not doing great. And that was actually very politically motivating. And it's also really important for folks in states that feel like they may be in a state that's really comfortable to understand that chances are there's a lot of work to be done in their very own state. And those states may be able to demonstrate some of the best models that could be replicated in states that are more perennially under-resourced. So, there's a huge value in sort of lifting up to everyone that each and every state in our country actually has work to do, and that there's value for policymakers to work together to solve this issue because it will hit every single one of their constituents. The next thing that I wanted to note, which won't be surprising to most, is that there are disproportionate impacts on vulnerable communities and historically underserved communities. What was notable, however, was that we thought there would be, a really big delta between rural communities and suburban and urban communities. There really wasn't. And what that means is that both infrastructure and cost, which are sort of cited as the sort of 1-2 of why people are in the digital divide, those problems exist in all of those types of geographies. So in urban environments, there are certainly there's infrastructure close by, but there's a lack of upgraded infrastructure. So, to one example, if you go to Philadelphia, which houses Comcast, and you'll see their huge towers and huge buildings that have been built by Comcast right in the city. Certainly those buildings are probably well connected. In the shadow of those buildings are neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods that have satellite dishes on roofs. What this indicates is that there has been redlining, that certain communities have been historically underserved. And so at some point, they decided that they would have to opt for a satellite option in, a well-connected city, presumably. Why in an urban environment someone is opting to use satellite? The same sort of last ditch solution that we see in rural environments is really a matter of public policy. And so, the solution is actually a matter of public policy and agreement. Urban areas and suburban areas could easily have rules, requirements to not only extend service, but require upgrades that walk in lockstep with upgrades in other more well-resourced and wealthier neighborhoods, and those public policy changes could make a huge dent in these numbers. In rural areas, there's still a concern of the expensive cost of serving areas because of the geography, because of sort of the lack of density, but even there are anchor institutions that are now served. There's a fair amount of penetration into rural areas. And so the days of rural areas being just sort of zero are long gone. And certainly they've had access to satellite for some time. So again, public policy measures to either support or bring down the cost of the options that are in place, incentivizing competition into these communities to sort of more sort of with market-based options is another way. And then just putting the thumb on the scale and actually building and upgrading with more community-based solutions is another way of breaking the logjam in these communities. But they're all experiencing both infrastructure and cost support issues. The last thing that we did was put a number on it. How much does it cost? So we identified how many students were in it. We also actually identified how many teachers, about 400,000 teachers were in the K-12 digital divide. And then we told policymakers how much it would cost in the first year to close it, and then what it would cost to keep it going annually. That is important. Policymakers really want to know what that number is. They won't always give you everything that's required in your estimate, but certainly an estimate is a really good starting place. And so putting that estimate together, while, based on, again, changing data and evolving standards, is still a really important piece of successfully pushing for solutions. And we were able to get $7 billion in our first year. For the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which directly supports schools and libraries seeking to provide students with connectivity to the home and curriculum quality devices. We also have been pressuring Congress to make long-term changes, and also are trying to get states who are now flush with funding from the infrastructure package to consider how they're going to use the money through the lens of the K-12 digital divide. If we are unable to connect a disconnected student, we find that they will have a lower GPA, that they will have lower annual income, and then that will result in a financial impact for the country in $22 to $33 billion of annual GDP loss. That doesn't even incorporate, that's a pretty conservative estimate, because it doesn't really incorporate all of these other additional public costs that could also come from having a cohort of students who are unable to have these higher earnings and what that means. So there's a substantial impact on loss of GDP. And that's another way to get policymakers to sort of understand the larger implications, that it's not just an altruistic $7 billion a year, but that there is an actual return on that investment, or that they're staunching a loss that they would otherwise have to absorb. And that really does turn their head. Again, I think states are now going to be positioned with even less resources administratively, and they are going to want to get the dollars out the door really quickly. And it's really important that they use the money that they have in a way that actually closes the K-12 digital divide. I sort of spoke to this earlier, but what happened after our reports came out and the work that we were able to do based on this research was that states started investing in digital needs assessments at the school level, broadband infrastructure upgrades. California just made, I think it was like about a $6 billion middle mile upgrade investment. Public policy changes to encourage competition. The state of Arkansas pushed back on anti-municipal broadband, so really encouraging competition and allowing small communities to kind of determine their broadband future. And the state of New York has actually put out language to require low-cost broadband service offerings as a requirement to all broadband providers that are serving their state. The federal government has invested billions of dollars. I mean, $65 billion from the infrastructure package. Of that, there is about $14 billion going into a permanent cost support program. That has never been done before. Of the dollars already out the door, not even included in that 65, like I said, is the $7 billion that went to the K-12 digital divide. That has really successfully moved out the door quickly. And so about $5 billion in requests came in for that $7 billion within like just the first two windows. That was just like months into the program's development. And then I think almost $3.5 billion have already been granted. So there are already devices that have been accounted for, and connectivity to the home that's already been doled out, which is really impressive in terms of speed of the program. The downside is the program is set to expire. So when that $7 billion is exhausted, the program will be closed. And so that means that schools are forced to make short-term decisions with the way they're spending that money. And what needs to be done next is to make sure that schools, other institutions serving vulnerable kids and families, um, continue to demonstrate to policymakers how they've got to use these funds to make long-term changes to close that persistent K-12 digital divide. So making big investments in infrastructure and making sure that they're done equitably so that, areas like hard to reach areas like rural areas don't get upgraded with, just anything, but actually like really robust future-proof broadband to the extent possible. Areas in urban and suburban areas should no longer be left behind and should be immediately upgraded. Um, and and that the benefits to sort of families and kids is that you'll have all these other institutions in the healthcare space, like telemedicine, in the education space, that will be able to deliver innovative solutions, supports, and resources to this cohort, which they wouldn't have been able to do just because of the lack of infrastructure. It also lowers the cost of the delivery of service and makes sure that when educators do have to deploy connectivity to students, that they aren't using the most expensive options like hotspots, but they actually have the capacity to think through a more longer term, robust, sustainable option that is cheaper but offers better quality of service, like school sponsored service that offers fixed service options. These are all sort of longer term options. It requires longer term thinking, and it requires for schools who will be dependent on this funding that they have assurances that these programs are going to stick around. So it's really up to now the states and to some extent the federal government to demonstrate to schools and families that they are actually going to make long-term investments in this program, and that they're going to use this money wisely in a way that will provide long-term supports to address the K-12 digital divide.